This is Bible Geography 3, the Life of Christ, Lesson 3, and tonight we're going to be starting really full bore into the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. So we'll be focusing mostly into chapter 18. For the rest of the class, we may, of course, jump around a little bit. We're on page 11 in our notes, and you see at the top, I want to give full credit and reference to the Thompson Chain Reference Study Bible. Have any of you ever seen the Thompson or heard of the Thompson Chain Reference Study Bible? They have in there the best maps of the life of Christ, and I have to say, it was these maps that are in the back of the Thompson Chain Reference Study Bible. I'll put them on that really did inspire me to take a whole semester and do the life of Christ. And I guess all these footprints, you see all these footprints. Let me just show you. So this is like his year, what he calls his year of popularity. And the footprints of Jesus all around Galilee. It got me very interested exactly where was he going, you know? He was making these circles around Galilee. So that interested me. And the Thompson Chain Reference Study Bible, I'm going to use his 3-point outline on the life of Christ here on page 11. So the initial years of Jesus, we could say, are the years of obscurity before his baptism and then before he entered into public ministry. So we'll just call them the years of obscurity. But then when he entered his ministry, we call the first year of the ministry of Jesus his year of inauguration. We're going to call it that. And you will have to know these 3 major years of the ministry of Jesus. His first year is year of what? Inauguration. His year of inauguration. Now, what happened during that year? His ministry began with his baptism. With his baptism, and then right after his baptism was his temptation. He came out of the temptation and he made his initial contacts with his disciples, and that's actually in John chapter 1. We've been studying about that, where he makes his initial contacts with men around the Sea of Galilee region. They would become his apostles later on. He does his first miracles and his first visit to Jerusalem, where he cleansed the temple, John chapter 2. His personal work in Jerusalem with Nicodemus, Samaria, the Samaritan woman. And that all happened at the very beginning of his ministry, his first year. So those were the opening events, if you will. His baptism, temptation, first disciples, first miracle, water into wine, John 1 and 2. His early Judean ministry, then when he went out of, he ministered around Judea, cleansed the temple, his discourse with Nicodemus. He baptized in Judea, John 2 and 3. Then his Samaritan ministry, lasting just a few days. And then he went back into Galilee after John the Baptist's arrest. That was his first year. So basically, none of that is covered in the Synoptic Gospels except his baptism and temptation. It just kind of skips out of his first year. So, you know, you're in Mark chapter 1, for example, this didn't dawn on me until years after being a Christian. But look, for example, go to Mark chapter 1, and you're literally in verse 14 of Mark chapter 1, you're in the second year of Jesus's ministry. So and you're in the 14th verse of the first chapter. 1 year of his ministry is already done. So that's the difference between the Synoptics and the Gospel of John. We'll see that a little bit later. So then number 3, his year, the second year of Jesus's ministry is his year of popularity. His year of popularity. His second year is highlighted by Jesus centering his ministry where? He gets kicked out, almost thrown off a cliff and killed in Nazareth, and then he goes where to really center his ministry? Out of what town? Capernaum. So that's the blank there. So his ministry, that's his home base for ministry. He does many miracles there. He calls the 12 apostles, continuing his ministry, mostly in Galilee in this year of popularity. So we're going to say that his second year of ministry really begins with his rejection, his discourse and rejection in Nazareth. And again, it's really hard to say that was right at the beginning of his second year or whatever, but it was about that time, either the end of his first year, beginning of his second. But we're just going to say that just for sake of keeping some parameters here. that his second year of his ministry begins with his rejection at Nazareth, and then continuing into his ministry in Galilee, calling the 12 apostles. Now, when he calls the 12 apostles, and if you're still in Mark, he calls his 12 apostles in Mark chapter 3 and verse number 16, around in there, where he calls his 12 apostles. Half of his earthly ministry is over at that point. So what does that tell us, though? The second half of his earthly ministry, there was, in a sense, because now he was really, his disciples were now apostles, the second half of his earthly ministry, the same amount of time, but probably of more importance in a lot of ways. More time is given to it in the Gospels, the second half of his ministry. So
how old is Jesus at this time when he started?
Most people say he was around 30 years old when he was baptized, and he was crucified at around the age of 33. That was always been my understanding.
Okay. What did you say again about his years of obscurity?
Well, we'll talk more about it, but his years of obscurity is all his years from birth until his baptism.
So when you say the
because we know so little,
is the start of his ministry, the first minute?
The first year, that year of inauguration, is the first year of his earthly ministry, beginning with his baptism.
Right.
The baptism was the watershed moment that really thrust him into the public limelight, the public spotlight, better word, spotlight. So in that second year, his year of popularity, he does many miracles and discourses. We'll talk about it. And then the third year of his ministry, we're going to call the year of opposition, his year of opposition. So we have his year of inauguration, his year of popularity, his year of opposition, final year of his ministry. This is highlighted by his ministry in Perea, mostly in the Gospel of Luke, his later ministry in Judea, finally, then his later ministry in Judea, culminating in this Passion Week, his death, burial, and resurrection. Of course, the Gospel of John is heavily weighted to the last week of the ministry of Jesus Christ. So his fourth year, his Galilean ministry continues and then concludes, and then he goes into Perea, 3.5 months or so, and then his Passion Week. So letter C is his Perean ministry. His Perean ministry, about 3.5 months. Luke's gospel focuses in on that from Luke chapter 9 through 19. Then letter D is his Passion Week. John's gospel focuses in on that from John 12 through 19. Almost a third of the Gospel of John given to the final week. Then his crucifixion, his burial, his resurrection. So that's a summary, an overview. And of that, you need to know the 4 main points: his years of obscurity, his year of inauguration, his year of opposition, popularity, and then opposition. Okay. So, the life and ministry of Christ. The Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic means, and this is in your book, on the first column, page 216, what does synoptic mean? What does it say together there? To see together. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke have this similarity. They almost see together, I guess, is the idea of the life of Christ, each containing, however, distinctives all their own. Matthew and Luke include information about what? That John and Mark don't. Matthew and Luke speak of the birth of Christ. That's letter B. Okay? Letter C on the top page, 13. The synoptics pay special attention to Jesus's ministry in Galilee. Now that's in your book, second column, page 216. I'm getting that straight out of your book, so you could probably mark your book right there. The synoptics paid special attention to Jesus's ministry in Galilee, whereas John, on the other hand, paints a different portrait of Jesus's ministry. John emphasizes Jesus' ministry where? In your book, it says it. Second column, right under what I was just reading. In Jerusalem. You got to know this. This definitely you have to know. So the synoptics emphasize his ministry in Galilee, and John is always talking about Jesus going to the feast, right? And then, and of course, John talks about here, does emphasize the I am statements of Jesus and the 7 signs, or the signs that he is the Son of God. John says these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And he gives the different signs, the miracles that Jesus did, very specially chosen miracles that Jesus did, John gives to us. But Luke is amazing because he pays special attention to Jesus's ministry in Perea. And we located Perea on the map in this area just on the other side of the Jordan River. So Jesus, when he left Galilee, he didn't want to stay in Jerusalem because the persecution was so great. So he would kind of go back and forth between Perea and Jerusalem. And Luke is fascinating for that. And it's even interesting how he kind of writes about it. If you look just at a few verses about this, look at Luke chapter 9 and verse number 51. And who could read that for us? Okay, Edgar? Luke 9:51. Yes.
And it came to pass, when the time was come that he should be received up, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem.
Okay, so that he should be received up where? To do what? It was the time that he would be received up, to be offered as our sacrifice. Yeah, so we're in Luke 9. So he's heading toward Jerusalem, and that's where the Samaritans don't receive him. And James and John want to call fire down from heaven. So he's now beginning his move toward Jerusalem. And then it gives a lot of information that's not in the other gospels. So, and the next verse, these verses kind of connect, if you will. There's 3 dots on this Jesus journeying to Jerusalem. The next one is in Luke 13:22. Luke 13:22, and who could read that verse for us, please? Who has it? Oh, Edgar, go ahead. You'll be our reader tonight.
And he went through the cities and villages, teaching and journeying toward Jerusalem.
Okay, so that other verse said he steadfastly set his face. This says he was going through the villages, so he was moving toward Jerusalem, but he was doing other things along the way. And Luke describes that. And so these different parables, the parable of the lost things, the parable of the unprofitable steward, and the story of the rich man and Lazarus, that's all in Luke, nowhere else in the other gospels. And then in Luke 17, if you look in Luke 17, in verse 11, here's the 3rd dot where he's journeying toward Jerusalem. He is steadfastly set toward Jerusalem. He's journeying toward Jerusalem. Luke 17:11 now says, and Ellie, do you have that?
Now it happened as he went to Jerusalem that he passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee.
So that's kind of interesting. He's been journeying to Jerusalem this whole time, but he's still in the midst of Samaria and Galilee. So he's still not there yet. But so you see, there's the movement of him going to Jerusalem, and a lot of people believe also that it was in Perea at this time and in and around. And then finally in Luke 19, and here is the triumphal entry where he's coming into Jerusalem. and verse number 41. And when he was come near, he beheld the city and wept over it. So that's his journey into Jerusalem. Now he arrives with tears and for the triumphal entry. But he was in and out of Jerusalem as well, and Perea and around, teaching at that time. So that's kind of Luke. Luke's pays special attention, though, to Jesus' ministry in Perea and in a different way than the other synoptics. Okay. So any questions? Any questions or comments about that? Okay, so let's now go to his years of obscurity, and let's focus in on the map, and we'll see exactly, step by step, the life of Christ. Where does the earthly life of Christ begin? In a virgin's womb. We could say his life began in the womb. So his life, in a sense, begins in Bethlehem, in the womb of Mary. I'm sorry, in Nazareth, in the womb of Mary. And then, of course, the Lord moves them to go where for the taxation? Where do they go in Luke chapter 2? They move to Bethlehem. So that's letter A. Okay, so if you look at your map here and just locate Nazareth. Nazareth, of course, which is around the area of the Sea of Galilee. And they move from Nazareth and down to Bethlehem. Now, whether they go around Samaria, we don't know. It just says, that they went there for the taxation. And we're well familiar with the story. It's the Christmas story. We've read it every year, it seems, of our lives. A tax census ordered, requiring subjects to enroll in their ancestral home. Joseph and Mary traveled to Bethlehem. This place was prophesied in Micah 5, verse 2, as the birthplace of Christ. So let me just back up for, not really just, maybe just back up for just a moment and talk about this region of Galilee for a moment. So look in your map. You could look on page 220 and 221. And again, locate Nazareth. Nazareth is in Galilee, but you see it's a little bit inland. It's not right on the Sea of Galilee. Do you see where it is? There? It's a little bit west of the Sea of Galilee. So Galilee at this time, the capital of Galilee, what was the capital of Galilee at this time? It tells us in our book
Tiberius.
that, it was after this, actually, during his earthly life or so, but we're told, actually Herod Antipas, when Herod Antipas took over from Herod the Great, so not right when Jesus was born, because King Herod the Great was still ruling, but there's some interesting things here we have to get, and one of these cities isn't even mentioned in the Bible from what I know, but when Herod Antipas took over from Herod the Great, he made what city the capital of Galilee? And it's on, were you going to say?
It says okay.
Oh, there it does. It says it right there. I gave you the answer. Okay, this city, Sepphoris. So go to page 220. 220 on the first column there. It says, in addition to the numerous villages, Galilee had several cities that were the focus of administration and commerce. Sepphoris served as the regional capital under Herod Antipas until Herod founded Tiberius in AD 18 or 19. So up until about AD 18 or 19, so this would have been like during the childhood of Jesus, that Sepphoris, this city of Galilee, would have been the capital. Now look at where Sepphoris is in relationship to Nazareth. On the map page, it's page 107. You can see it there. Do you see where Sepphoris is?
North of
Just
Nazareth.
north of.
It's just north, just a few miles north. So you would have to think that Jesus would have gone there and would have been in Sepphoris. And if you also go back to page 209, where Herod Antipas is highlighted, on that second column there of page 209, where it says, in that first paragraph down, are you with me? Where it says Antipas was a clever, competent ruler, and then go down a few more lines where it says recent excavations have confirmed, are you with me there?
Yes.
Josephus' statement that Antipas made Sepphoris the most beautiful city of Galilee, a thriving city adorned with colonnaded street and theater. So here's a picture of the theater right beside this. That's the Roman theater at Sepphoris. A thriving city ordained colonnade street. Sepphoris functioned as the capital of Galilee until AD 18. So I got a few of these pictures just so you could see this region, and this is what Jesus would have looked at as a boy growing up in these beautiful rolling hills, the Western Mountains in Galilee. And this is an aerial look at Sepphoris, and this would be the theater that is pictured in our book right here. That would be that same theater pictured on page 209. And here's a few more closer looks at some of the ruins. So beautiful tile work.
Wow.
So this was like a Roman city in Galilee. This was the capital of Herod Antipas. Then around AD 18 or 19 or so, our book tells us that he built Tiberius. Now look at where Tiberius is on our map. Where is Tiberius in relationship to Sepphoris? Right on the Sea of Galilee. And I believe it's still a very popular tourist site. Am I right on that? I believe I am. Did you go to Tiberius?
I went to the Sea of Galilee. I'm not sure if we went
Okay.
to Tiberias.
So remember, in this patron culture where lower level rulers would do favors for their superiors in order to get promoted, who did Herod Antipas name this city after? Tiberius, the Caesar, who had taken over for Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus. Okay, so we see where it is, and this is right on the Sea of Galilee. It's very beautiful, actually. And so here's a picture of a castle. I don't think that castle would have been there during the life of Christ, but here's some ancient ruins there in Tiberias. And this is an overview, an aerial shot of some of the ruins that are there also. So I found a few of those pictures. So this is, again, the life of Christ and him growing up. These were two of the major cities, political centers in Galilee. Sepphoris and Tiberias. Not really highlighted in the scripture, but they would be important cities in Christ's life.
So letter B is what?
Letter B, we didn't get there.
Oh.
We didn't yet. That's okay. This is all free. This is all free.
And doesn't the Bible also refer to the Sea of Galilee as the Sea of Tiberias in places?
Yeah. I believe you will find Tiberias. Yeah, the Sea of Tiberias. Yeah, good point. Because it was became the capital during the earthly ministry of Christ. Tiberias would have been the capital city of Galilee. And interesting too. Remember what Jesus called Herod Antipas. What did he call him? He called him that fox. He grew up a few miles away from where Herod Antipas ruled. So maybe he knew a lot of things. Maybe he had gone into the city and seen him. So the first movement and here's some pictures that I found of ancient Nazareth, what Nazareth may have looked like back in the days of Christ on its rolling hills, just a small village. And I found this, so this could have been some kind of a house similar to what maybe Jesus had lived in. And even here is a very, this is kind of like a ancient first century home, very, very small. People may have slept out on the roof. Maybe they had flat roofs. So they would use the roof as well, maybe for sleeping. And this would be the hillside of Bethlehem. So now getting to our notes where Joseph and Mary are moving from Bethlehem to Jerusalem, they would have been traveling and along, and seeing beautiful hillsides such as this, journeying from Bethlehem to Jerusalem. So then letter B is they go to Jerusalem. From Bethlehem, they go to Jerusalem. So again, if you look here on the map, on page 105, here's the map of Jesus' birth and early childhood. They start in Nazareth. They go to Bethlehem. Jesus is born. What happens after Jesus is born? On the 8th day, they bring him to Jerusalem to circumcise him. Now, it's kind of very interesting. Luke chapter 2, if you go to Luke chapter 2, after Jesus was circumcised, Simeon says, I'm ready to die. I could die now. I've held the Messiah. Remember that? It was like, I'm ready to go. Glory to God. And he prophesies too that a sword shall pierce through Mary's soul. Incredible prophecy in verse 35, Luke chapter 2. But then in verse 39 it says, and when they had performed all things according to the law of the Lord, they returned into Galilee to their own city of Nazareth. But wait, do they go from Jerusalem to Nazareth? Where do they go? Probably back to Bethlehem. Probably back to Bethlehem first. We don't know the timing of the wise men. Maybe the wise men, because this was the 8th day. Did the wise men come? Do you think the wise men came before the 8th day of the birth of Jesus?
No.
Yeah, Micah thinks so. I'm not sure. I don't know. We're not sure. But they go. I believe they go back to Bethlehem. Our book says that. Like if you look at this little red arrow, the arrow is they go from Bethlehem to Jerusalem, and then they go back to Bethlehem. That's on page 105, the map number 105, right? And then that's when Joseph gets a dream. Don't go back to get out of Bethlehem because of Herod's murderous intentions, and go where? To go to Egypt, which is really quite amazing when you think. When you read about throughout the Old Testament, where did Israel always want to go to kind of like as a safety blanket when somebody was going to attack them or hurt? Where did they always want to go? Egypt. And the prophet often said, don't go to Egypt. But here's the Messiah. And the angel of the Lord says to Joseph to take the child and flee into Egypt. That's quite incredible, actually. To flee into Egypt. Well, why would that be? So they go down into Egypt. Again, it doesn't say where they went into Egypt, but in our map, it says there's an arrow, it's just somewhere. Somewhere in Egypt. Now, by the way, in our book here, in this little white box, you see that little white box? Let's see, where am I at here? Where'd it go? But you see it, okay, here. This little white box. What does it say? When was Jesus born? 6 or 7 BC. Again, I don't know about that at all. That seems a little off to me. So you could look more into that, but I'm just pointing it out that's his numbers, that he says Jesus was born 7 to 6 BC. So they go down into Egypt. And when do they return? Matthew chapter 2, verse 19. When do they return? When Herod died. So they're probably dating this as well based on the death of Herod. So when did he rule until? Till 4 BC. That's according to our chart here. So they're saying if he ruled until 4 BC, he had to have been born before that. So maybe a couple of years before that. That's why he's saying 6 or 7 BC. So anyway, so they go down into Egypt. When Herod dies, they return. And do you think Joseph is thinking he'll return to Bethlehem?
It was a long trip.
Okay, maybe so. Came into the land of Israel, and he heard that Archelaus did reign. He was afraid to go there, notwithstanding being warned of God in a dream. He turned aside into the parts of Galilee. So now just think about this. Why did Archelaus rule there now? Because what happened to Herod? He died. What did Herod want to do to the small children? Kill them. Now Archelaus is ruling, and he's what? It's still not safe. So one ruler takes the place of another, and things are still hard, you know. But Archelaus does reign. That's the only mention of Archelaus in the New Testament, there in that verse, Matthew 2:22. And he was warned of God in a dream, and he turned aside into the parts of Galilee. So maybe he just wanted to go there for a rest. That's true. Maybe he did. Maybe he thought, I don't know. I was just thinking, this is recology now, but it does seem that he's somewhat drawn to Bethlehem in his heart. Why? Because that was the land of his fathers. Yeah. And so maybe in going there after the census, maybe he felt a connection there and thought, hey, it would be great to return here. And this way we're close to Jerusalem. And it will be easier to travel to Jerusalem and worship God on the feast days. But it doesn't work. So he goes back to live in Nazareth. So that's where our map shows, back from Egypt. And then what highway do you think they would have taken? Out of Egypt, highway. They would have taken that highway. Okay, so in our notes then, we have them going to Jerusalem. We have C, the flight to Egypt. And that is true. It says in our notes, by night. By night. And then their return to, letter D. After Egypt, they return to Nazareth. That's letter D. And then Joseph receives 2 dreams as God directs him, to leave Egypt and then to return to Galilee. He received those 2 dreams. Number 1, that was number 1. Number 2, under letter D, to go into Galilee. That's where he goes into Galilee. He received the dream to go into Galilee as Archelaus reigned in Judea. And this was a fulfillment as well in the scripture. A fulfillment of where does it say out of Egypt? Oh, there it is. Yes. In Matthew 2:15. You know, I mentioned it's interesting that Jesus would have been called to go into Egypt, because that was often seen as a way of worldly trust, not trusting God, trusting the way of the world. But why did Jesus go into Egypt? Because of the prophecy in Hosea. And it's mentioned by Matthew in chapter 2, verse 15. And that's the prophet Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. Out of Egypt have I called my son. So God called his people out of Egypt, and Jesus Christ is the perfect Israelite. He is the perfect Israelite who has been called out of Egypt to walk fully and completely in the pathway and to fulfill the glory and perfect purposes of God. Out of Egypt have I called my son. So that's one prophecy there. And then the next prophecy is that he would go to Nazareth. Why Nazareth? And what was the prophecy there? That was our verse that you memorized in 2:23. Out of that, or that he shall be called a Nazarene. So what verse says that in the Old Testament? And actually, I looked this up around our Christmas season. I looked up Nazareth. Nazareth is never mentioned anywhere in the Old Testament. It's such an obscure city. It's never, ever mentioned. Incredible that Jesus Christ would live and grow up there in this totally unnamed city. And that's why some of the Jewish scribes would say, go and look, what prophet ever came out of Nazareth? But most believe that while Nazareth is not mentioned by name in the Old Testament, but it's a prophecy of how Isaiah said that he would grow as a root out of a dry ground. In other words, that he would be raised in a place of spiritual dryness, total obscurity, in the most unassuming of places. So then letter E, we'll just get to the bottom of this page. His visit to the temple in Jerusalem as a 12-year-old. So he goes back to Nazareth, and then these are really the quiet years, the years of obscurity. And we don't hear anything more of Jesus until he's 12 years old, and his parents take him to Jerusalem, and then, of course, what happens? They left him there. They're like, he's with you, right? Oh, he's with you, right? No, oh. Okay, so you know that story. So he goes to Jerusalem, and then they go back and find him. And then after that, we hear nothing of him. Those are the silent years, letter F. So those are the silent years from the age of 12 until his baptism. So that's map 105. And then we'll continue there in 2 weeks, as next week we will not have a class. You have a break. Keep up with your reading. Okay.